Hi everyone.
My name's Matthew Ingram. I'm the owner and beekeeper here at Holt Hall Apiary. We're a medium-sized bee farm based in Tamworth in Staffordshire. We've got around 130 hives now.
And so just a little bit of background about
me and our business. I started beekeeping about 5 years ago. I took it up as a hobby. I didn't expect to be doing anything with it. But after my first year
looking after the bees, I was just hooked. I couldn't think of anything I'd rather be doing, and so I just started
expanding, so we went quite quickly
from 2 to almost 20, and then up to the 60 mark, and then eventually to around where we are
this year. So we've grown quickly, we've learned a lot as we've gone along, and so yes, you're here to
learn a little bit about the bees and beekeeping. So we're going to head into the classroom shortly, and then we'll head out to the bees after we know a little bit about the basics of bees and beekeeping. So we'll head in now.
Hi everyone.
Welcome to our classroom here on the farm at Holt Hall Apiary. We're going to learn a little bit about beekeeping before we go out and actually see the bees. So we're going to start with a really brief history of beekeeping. So there's going to be some photos popping up on your screen about to sort of show what I'm talking about, because it's quite difficult just on the camera here. So the earliest images of humans working with bees is about 13,000 BC, so that's 15,000 years ago. Essentially what we can see in the cave paintings, which are little pictures that have been scratched onto the walls of caves, are people using smoke to try and calm down natural hives of bees. So they weren't managed, they weren't in beehives that they looked after, they were just wild in the trees. But that's the earliest we've been able to find of people working with bees. Moving forward a little bit, we get to the Egyptian times, and they were absolutely mad about honey. They loved it. It was a massive part of their life. Pharaohs were buried in their pyramids with big vats of honey for the afterlife. Amazingly, that honey is still edible. You could still eat it today. 3,000 years old, it's still perfectly fine to eat. So honey doesn't go off, it'll last forever, literally. And the Egyptians, they were the first to really start putting bees into man-made hives, and they used big clay tubes, and the bees would build their comb in there, and then the Egyptians would cut out the honey and store it for their own use. Move forward right up until the Middle Ages, so when we start thinking about knights and kings and queens in England, that's when we start seeing the next sort of stage of beekeeping, and that's when the beekeepers have moved them into big wicker baskets. So we don't see them very often anymore, but they were really common for about 400 or 500 years. The problem is bees store honey at the top of their hive. So to get to it in a basket, they had to cut through all of the brood, all of the young to get that honey, and it just wasn't very good for the bees. They killed off a lot of hives, and that's not what you want to be doing if you're a beekeeper. And so in about 150 years ago, we moved on to the same system as what we use now. So beekeeping hasn't really moved forward very far since then. So that's a really brief history of beekeeping. The bees themselves, there's about 20,000 different species of bee in the world. So that's absolutely loads of different species. You never think there could possibly be that many. But in the UK, we have at least 250 different species, so we've still got lots of different types of bee, even in the UK. Most of those will be solitary bees that live in little nooks and crannies. If you've got a bug hotel, that's the sort of bee that will be living in those. and the vast majority are those solitary bees. We've then got bumblebees, which there's quite a few different types of those, and then we've got honeybees. So in the UK we've only got the one type of honeybee, and that's something called Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee. And they're common throughout the world now, it's not just limited to Europe. The bees that we go through today, just like any other animal, you get different breeds. So within the European honeybee there's different breeds, and the one that we use here is something called Carniolan, which is native to Europe, mainland Europe, but they get through winter really well, and they build up really big hives, 70,000 bees in every single hive, so they're absolutely massive, and they produce loads of honey, and that's exactly what we need as beekeepers. Okay, so we know we've got European honeybees and they're Carniolan, but inside the hive we've got 3 different types of bee as well. So we've got the drones, and they're the boys. So most people think the whole hive is made up of the males and the queen is the only female, but that's not true. Most of the hive is actually female. Only 3 or 4% of the hive are male. So they only make up a really small number of the hive, and they don't collect any resources or anything like that. They're solely there for reproduction. They're there so that the queen can lay eggs to produce the next generation. We've then got the queen, so she's mother to all of the bees in that hive. She's often thought to be the most important bee, and in many ways she is. Without her, none of the other bees can exist. But the queen needs the workers. She can't live on her own either. She needs to be fed and looked after, and the workers do that. So it's very much a case that the workers as a big collective group are the ones in charge, not the queen. She can be laying up to 2,000 eggs every single day, so that's a lot of eggs. She lays the most in June, July and August, and then she starts reducing down right through into the winter when she'll actually almost stop laying eggs. It's just too cold for them. When it's too cold, they can't keep those eggs warm and they don't hatch. So the queen stops laying eggs. Through the rest of the year, the vast majority of what she lays are workers. So the workers are the bees that we see everywhere, out and about, in the gardens. That's what we'll be seeing. Now, the workers, when they're first born, they're grey and fluffy, but they can't really do very much. They can't sting, and they're not particularly good at flying. So their first job is cleaning. So they hatch out of their cell, and we'll almost certainly see it when we go through the hive. We'll see workers with their heads right at the back of the cell cleaning it out. So the bee hatches out, but they've got to clean those cells so the queen can lay in them again. So they almost straight away come out and then go back in a different cell and clean it out, ready for the queen to lay in it again. And as I say, I'm sure we'll see plenty of bees doing that when we go through the hive in a bit. Their next job is rubbish disposal. So they don't like anything in the hive that could cause them any damage. So if any bees die in the hive, if any larvae die in the hive, if we were to drop a leaf in there when we went through, the next week you could guarantee it would have been taken out and dropped outside. The bees are really good at cleaning their hive. They don't want anything that could cause them any damage, so they try and pick it up and they fly it away from the hive and drop it outside. So that's their next job. So after about 3 days, when they're nice and strong, that's when they start to do those sorts of jobs. At day 4, they develop this part in their mouth that allows them to produce royal jelly. And royal jelly is really special because it's really high in protein and goodness that lets the bees grow really fast. They eat pollen and nectar, and then they produce this new food that they feed to all of the larvae, which is called royal jelly. And I'm sure we'll see some of that. It's white and it's thick, but it's really good food for the bees. At about day 7, so nearly a week old, we start seeing them looking after the queen. So this is why people thought the queen was in charge. She's got a small group of workers that are there feeding her, cleaning her, following her around, and it looks like she's being looked after. It's actually more a case that the bees are just trying to keep her really fit and healthy so that she can lay as many eggs as possible. So it's more that the workers are telling her where to go than actually following her around. But it's only a very small number of workers that do that at any time. We then get fanning the hive. So we're hatching eggs out just like chickens in an incubator. The hive is staying warm to keep those eggs warm, safe, so that they're going to hatch. The temperature is controlled by a couple of ways. So if it's really hot, the bees will collect water, spread it really thinly over the comb and fan their wings. And then you get something called evaporative cooling, which is why we sweat. It's the same thing. So they're basically making their honeycomb sweat by adding water. If it's too cold, the bees will cluster together just like penguins all over the top of the brood and the eggs to keep it nice and warm. And if it's really cold, they can unattach their wing from the muscle inside and move their muscle really, really fast, which generates heat, but they don't actually move anything. So I think that's really clever. After about a week and a half, they develop this area of their body that allow them to produce wax. And beeswax is white when they first produce it, so we usually see beeswax and it's yellow, and that's older wax through use. But when it's first produced, it's white, and the bees produce it in tiny little flakes, and then use their mouth to shape it into the hexagons that we see all around. Guarding the hive then. So a hive is really precious to the bees, and they don't want anybody getting in there that's going to cause them damage. So us as beekeepers, we can get in and we can manage the hive, and they won't be aggressive to us. We'll go in without gloves on, and that will be fine. But things like wasps, bees from another hive, through the winter mice, they all become a really big problem for the bees. And so we've got what's called guard bees, and they're older bees that are around the entrance, ready to defend the hive to stop any other insects trying to get in. And then we've got collecting resources. So the last 3 or 4 weeks of their life is spent collecting resources. So that's collecting food, like pollen, nectar, which gets processed into honey. So the bees collect nectar from the flowers. And when they collect it, it's really runny. It's more like water with a little bit of sugar in it. The bees then process it. They start fanning it to sort of try and get rid of all the water off it and make it nice and thick and tasty, which is exactly what we want. They also collect propolis, which you'll see stains everything yellow in the hive. And you'll see it sticking the crown board down, and that's produced by trees, but the bees always collect it. And it can be quite good because it's like a hand wash. It's antibacterial, antifungal, and it just allows the bees to keep that hive nice and clean. So the hive itself, the hive we're going to use, we use British National. So we've got one here, and we'll put it together as we're talking it through. So we start off with open mesh floor, so you can see through it, but there is actually a mesh screen there, so the bees can't get through it. But it allows for really good ventilation. Here we have the entrance, so you can just see, if we get the light right, you can just see the gap there. And that's a small entrance, but more than big enough for the bees. So we place that down on the bottom, and then we have what's called a brood box. So the brood box is the part that we're really interested in. So the boxes are hollow. They all just slot together, they just sit on top of each other. We then fill these boxes with frames. So this is an empty wooden frame that the bees will be living on. So when we go through the hive, it's these frames that we want to be looking at and making sure that everything is healthy. So in this brood box, we're going to have 11 of these frames. You can fit 12 in sometimes, but it's a little bit tight. So we want between 11 and 12 frames in this bottom box. We then put on something called a queen excluder. So we'll show you this in more detail as we go through the hive. But this basically, we've got little holes in it, and the holes are big enough that the workers can climb through it, but small enough that the queen can't fit through it. So it means that we know the queen has to be in this brood box. She can't go anywhere else in the hive. We'll move it to one side a little bit there. We've then got the honey super. So that's a smaller box, much smaller than the brood box, and that just sits on top again, and everything just stacks together. This box is smaller because it weighs a lot. So this, when it's full of honey, will weigh maybe 10 kilos. If we use the brood box, it would weigh almost 20 kilos, and that's a lot of weight to be lifting every time we check a hive. So these ones get little frames. So they're much smaller, tiny frames. And here we'll show you what it looks like inside the comb. So there you can see the hexagons that the bees have built, and they're all perfect. So this is a frame that we actually extracted from this spring, but it's now empty, ready for the bees to refill. So that just gets slotted into the hive, like so. On top of that then, we put something called a crown board. So if we left it without any board on top of here, just the roof, the bees would build comb up into the roof and we'd never be able to get it apart again. So we put on this thin board that just helps the bees, well, helps us to manage the bees so that we don't get comb built absolutely everywhere. And then on the top then, finish it off, it's a nice big waterproof lid, and we need that in the UK particularly so that the bees don't get wet, because wet bees don't do very well, but they die quite quickly. The bees will manage in cold weather really well, but as soon as they get damp, they don't do well at all. So, inspecting a hive. So when we go out and check the hive today, we're going to be looking for a few things. So we check every hive once a week. The idea of that is basically to make sure the hive is healthy and the bees are doing well. So we want to make sure the queen is still there. So we want to be seeing either the queen or eggs. If we see eggs, we know she's got to be in there because the eggs hatch out after about 3 days. So if we see eggs, we know the queen's got to have been there in the last couple of days, and we're happy. So we want to be checking the hive to make sure we've got eggs, the queen is there. We want to make sure the hive has enough space as well. So when the hive runs out of space, they try to swarm. So we'll put a picture up on here of a swarm. Basically that's the queen and about half of the workers from the hive. They've flown out of the hive to go and make a hive somewhere else. And that's just because they've got too busy in there and they've moved out. So we know that's happening when we start to see queen cells. And they kind of look like acorns hanging off the frames. And each one of them would have a queen in them if we left them. The problem with that is that very often they will keep swarming, even with a young queen, until there's almost nothing left in the hive. And then it doesn't get through winter. So we have to be really careful and making sure that the bees are healthy and that they're not trying to swarm. We don't want them swarming. As a beekeeper, we don't want them swarming because we lose quite a bit of honey and the bees. But also, now we're getting through to late July, and it's just not good enough really. The weather's not been that good, and if we leave them too late to swarm, they will not survive winter. So we need to keep them in the hive, healthy, and and basically let them and give them the best chance to get through the winter. The other reason for checking the hives is disease. So we're like the vets of the beekeeping world. So we want to be checking through our hives and making sure they're healthy, that there's no diseases there. One of the most common things we find is something called varroa mite. So that's a little bug that lives on the bee, and you wouldn't think a bee, being as small as it is, could have a bug on it, but it does. The varroa mite is a relatively new thing. It's only been in the UK about 30 years, and the bees haven't got used to it yet, and it can cause them a lot of damage. We know every hive will have it. Every hive in the UK will have varroa mite. We just have to be careful with making sure there isn't too much. A little bit the bees can deal with, but too much the bees can't. And so we have to give them a little treatment in the autumn and in the winter to help them to survive. So that's really the very basics of beekeeping. We're checking every hive once a week to make sure that they're not swarming, they're healthy, and that we can see all the different types of bee that we mentioned earlier. So we'll head over to our training apiary and we'll get going through some hives.
Right, welcome to our training apiary. So this is where we bring our new beekeepers to learn about beekeeping. We've got 2 hives here, and we're going to go through just the one today and see what we can find and make sure everything's looking good. So I'll get my veil up and the smoker started, and we'll open up this hive. Right, we've got our smoker going. So the smoker is basically just sawdust that's smouldering at the bottom, producing a bit of smoke, but it's not warm. There's grass on top of it to keep the sawdust down, so that we don't agitate the bees by spreading sawdust all over the top of them as well. So we'll go ahead and take the lid off this hive, and then we'll start going through it. Okay then, so we'll take this lid off. It's a little bit stiff. There we go, we've already got loads of bees showing up on the top of the hive, so that's a good sign that it's a nice strong hive. Just give them a little bit of smoke, just lets them know that we're coming in. So this is called a crown board, and we just want to take this off, and it will go with a bit of a pop. The bees stick everything down with a substance called propolis, which is like a resin that's produced by trees, and it sticks absolutely everything down. You can see it's all red here, and that is what's sticking everything down. So now we've got the lid off, we just want to give them a little bit more smoke. Not much, just a bit, just to keep them nice and calm. So we'll open up one of these frames, and this is called a honey super, and this is where the bees are storing their precious honey. So we'll open it and pull out this frame. Straight away you can see all of the bees on here, and inside all of these cells, so I'm going to show you, is honey. You can just see it shining at the bottom of the cells, and if I just score this here, you can see all of the honey running out. So all underneath the white wax is honey. So bees always store honey with a white capping on it. So each one of these frames weighs about 1 kilo. So this full box is just over 10 kilos of honey. So that's quite a lot of honey really, considering they're coming from such small animals. So we'll go ahead and take this first box off. So we want to work our way down to the brood box, which is the bottom box. So we use a hive tool to just get into a crack and then just prise it apart. Again, it's well stuck down with propolis. I think we've got it there. There we go. So this is a really heavy box. We'll just put it to one side, out of the way. And again, more smoke. So every time we go down a layer, we use a little bit more smoke, just to keep them nice and calm.
makes it much easier to work. You see, I'm going through the hive with no gloves on, and the bees are absolutely fine. They're not aggressive bees, only if you cause damage to them will they try and sting. So there we go, that's the next box off. And it's a nice full box as well. So on the bottom here you'll see a grid, and this grid is what's called a queen excluder, and that's stopping the queen from being able to move through. So the holes in it are big enough that the workers, the little worker bees, can get through it, but the holes are too small for the queen to get through it. So we'll just take this off, and here you can have a look at it. So you can see the holes in it, and the workers can crawl through those gaps, but the queen can't, because she's much bigger. We'll put that to one side as well. And this is the box that we're interested in. So again, a little bit more smoke, don't need too much. A few sprays, puffs of smoke. Now we're going to use the hive tool again, but rather than using the square end, we're going to use this rounded end. And it just fits into the gap and allows us to just slide out the frames. So this is the box that we're really interested in. There we go. We need to be nice and slow and calm, and there we can see all of the bees. So straight away this frame's interesting, because in each one of these cells, we'll just move the bees, we're just tapping them on the back. So in each one of these cells we've got larvae. So I don't know if you'll be able to see it through there, but if not, we'll put a picture up of what we're looking at. And interestingly, right down at the bottom here, we have something called queen cells. So in each, if I just open this up, you'll be able to see there, that is royal jelly, and that's got a baby queen in it. So all those three have, and this is a sign that the hive is really busy. Too busy, and that the bees are going to want to try and to swarm to build a new home. So we're just going to just squash those down a little bit out of the way. We have a look on the other side as well, and there's another one, a much bigger one. So we don't want that either. We don't want the bees to be swarming. It's not good for the bees, because particularly at this time of year, being in July, the bees struggle to build back up ready for the winter, and they need to be as strong as possible for the winter. So we've been away from the bees for a second, so you can see they've all come back up onto the top. So we just get a couple of puffs of smoke, and they crawl back down over the frames so that they're out of the way. So we'll open up the next frame. Here we go. What have we got? So this also feels heavy. So in here we've got loads of brood as well. So this queen is laying extremely well. So again, you should just be able to see the larvae in the right at the back of the cells, kind of just white dots. And we want to be making sure that we can see eggs and larvae, and we know that they're healthy then, because the queen is still there. Also on this frame we have some drones. So drones are the males, so the vast majority of the bees on here are workers. But then there is some drones. You see this one here, it's quite a bit bigger. So that one there is a drone. They kind of look like they've got big sunglasses on their head, so that's a boy. Just have a look on the other side. So we've got loads of bees on this side. Not too many drones on this side, I don't think. There's one up here, so you can see him there. He's again quite big. And we'll put this frame back in there. That this frame is healthy, but again there's a couple of little queen cells there. So we're going to definitely need to give this hive a bit more space. I'm just going to give it a little shake to get some of the bees off in there, so we don't damage them when we slide it in. And we're just going to gently pop that frame back in. There we go. A little bit of smoke. And on to the next frame. So we're going to go through every frame, and we're wanting to try and find the queen. We want to make sure that they're healthy, they haven't got anything wrong with them. So we're sort of like the doctors for the bees as well as anything else. So here we've got loads of what's called capped brood. So in the same way that butterflies go through metamorphosis, so they change, bees do the same. So under each one of these is a little bee that's changing into a bee from a larvae. So the queen lays eggs, and she lays up to about 2,000 eggs every single day in the summer. They, after 3 days, hatch into larvae, which are kind of like little grubs. And then after 21 days after she lays the egg, a fully formed bee appears, and when they're born they're really nice and fluffy, and you can just hear, have a look into that on there, you can just see the head of a drone just starting to poke out of itself. So that is going to be a completely newborn bee that we've got to see while we're here. This cell here is where a bee is hatched out, so you can see that it's open and there's kind of like a little door on it, and that's where the bees have chewed the wax to let the bee out because it's fully grown. When they're first born, they're really fluffy and they're grey, but then they become a little bit less fluffy after about 24 hours. They start to go back to the darker colour of the rest of the bees, but they're quite cute when they're first born. Let's see what else we can find. See, the bees aren't aggressive at all, so you don't need to worry about bees so long as you're not kind of hurting them or knocking them. The bees are really nice and gentle. So again, quite a lot of eggs in the bottom of the cell, so we'll pop a picture on of what the eggs look like, because they're really hard to show on a camera. Loads of brood, so this queen's done really well, and that's what we want to see, but that's also why they're looking to try and swarm. So they've built up too big, this hive is too full, and she wants more space, and that's why we're going to give them another box when we finish this inspection. So we do this every 7 days. We check every single hive every 7 days, and that way we can try and stop the swarming from happening. So we'll just check out what's going on down here by just tapping the bees, and they'll move out of the way. There we go, they're being nicely behaved. And up on this one we've got them storing a bit of pollen. So pollen is the protein of their diet, so that's where they get all the goodness from. So in these cells here you see a few different colours, and those colours are all different sorts of pollen. So some really bright orange in there, so that's like some dandelions, which you see usually as a weed in the gardens, but dandelions are a really good source of food for the bees, so we do like dandelions. There was also some bright red, which is probably from a horse chestnut, a conker tree, and that produces really dark red pollen, and it's really good for the bees because it flowers quite early. What's really interesting, if you have a look at a conker tree when it's in flower next year, the flowers are different colours, and when they're yellow it means that the bees haven't pollinated it yet, and when they turn red it means that the bees have already been there and they've already done their job. So the tree tells you and tells the other bees if it's been pollinated or not, which is really clever. So on this one we've got loads of drone brood along the top. So the drones, the boys, are much bigger, so they get bigger cells where they're being produced, where they're being born, whereas the workers much smaller, but there's loads more of it. Look at all of it under here. So all of these are all full of brood, and you can also see some bees just crawling in the cells, so I'll come and show you those. So you can see bees kind of like this one here, is all the way in the cell, and that one's, and these, they're all cleaning out their cells ready for the queen to lay in them again. So it's just a A constant pattern. The queen lays in them. 3 weeks later, the bee hatches out. Then they clean the cell. That's their first job, is cleaning the cell before the queen lays in it again. So they're really good at recycling bees. So they just keep reusing what they've got. This is a nice heavier frame, and again there's loads of brood, and there is a big queen cell down at the bottom here. It's not quite closed yet. We can just see a little bit of royal jelly, and we can also, on this frame, we can see the queen. So if we look here, you can just see this bee with a blue dot on her. Well, that is the queen. She's a bit longer, you won't be able to see that. And the blue dot we put on, so we put that on her last year. So that basically just signifies that she was born in 2020. This year, any bees born, any queens born, are having a white dot popped on them, and we basically just use essentially just a felt tip pen, nothing special really. And it allows us just to keep everything nice and safe. We know she's the queen that we put in there last year, and we know when she was born, so we can try and keep a track of any problems that we might have. So we'll slide her back in really carefully. We don't want to do any damage to her. So she's mother to all of these bees, but you can see that they don't mind us handling the frame with the queen on. They'll know that the queen is on that frame. She has very strong pheromones, which is basically a smell that allows the bees to work out what's going on in the hive, and they'll know where the queen is and what she's doing. So this queen's been really good, so we've been really pleased with her this year, just because of how much brood she's produced. Really nice amount, so we can see under all of these bees. So we're just going to give it a little bit of a shake. And the bees don't mind, it just gets them off, and then we can see the frame properly. So you can see all of the brood, so all of that sort of, they tend to call it digestive biscuit coloured area. All of this area around here is all brood. So under each one of these is a little larvae, and we will take the top off one so it doesn't kill the bees. They get it out, so they survive it. So we'll just take the top off that, and we'll see if we can just show you. Just in that cell there, and you can just start to see the coloration, and the pink that you can see the side of it is actually where the eyes will be. So the eyes get their colour first, and then everything else. So they're a little bit sooner than the rest of the colour. So there we go. We'll put that frame back, and the bees will just seal that cell back up. It won't do any damage to them. In fact, sometimes you do see the brood developing without that cap over them. It's not ideal, but it is okay. But the bees will soon fix the problem. They're really good at problem solving. Nice heavy frame again. So it's looking like they've only had a few queen cells at the other end, so that bodes quite well, that we haven't got to worry about them going straight away if we give them more space. I'll open those up, and again there's no queen cells. Lots of brood hatching out, so this hive is just going to get stronger and stronger, and that's what we want to be seeing. We want a really nice strong hive so that it produces lots of honey for us and for them, so that they get through the winter nice and safely. So they need about 25 kilos of food to get through the winter, so that's a lot of food. And then we have all the surplus from them, so that's the extra. So anything that they don't need, we have. So that's where your honey comes from. So we have got a queen cell just tucked in here, and they're really good at hiding them, but we need to get rid of them, because if we don't, the bees will try and swarm, and they'll try and make up a new hive somewhere else. It's quite late for them to be doing that, so we want to try and avoid it for them and for us, because they'll also take quite a lot of honey with them. So we don't want that happening. So there we go. I think that's all of them on that frame. So there was about 3 on there, which is quite a few. I think everything else looks alright. There's one just clipped on the bottom. They're really good at hiding them sometimes. But we have to make sure we get them all. Okay. Smoke. We've only got 2 frames left to check on this one, and then we'll close the hive back up. So we try not to have the hive open for too long. The bees are really careful with what's going on inside the hive, so we want to make sure we're not causing too much damage to them. The queen, she has laid up a lot of this frame, so that's really good. So this is quite far out of the nest, so we expect brood really around the middle of the hive and less on either side. That's just because it's easier for them to keep it warm in the middle. So the same way as chickens, we use an incubator to keep the eggs warm. And you might have done that before, seen it. Basically we're doing the same thing with the bees. So the middle of here is about 35 degrees, so that's about the temperature of an incubator. And it's so that the eggs and the larvae can hatch out and they can survive and grow nice and safely. It's better for them to be nice and warm. A little bit more smoke for the last frame. Sometimes they really stick the last one down to the wall well, but they haven't actually. That's good. Okay. So this one, I'm glad we've seen this. You can see one here that's carrying its pollen. So it carries pollen on its legs. So you can see that really bright orange, and it really is bright orange pollen on its legs, and it'll scrape that pollen off into one of the cells and push it down, and that way they can store it for when the young need it. So it's just walking around, and it'll find the right cell to put that pollen in, and it'll get rid of it in there, and the bees will store it. So then, really happy with how this hive is looking. Loads of bees hanging off the bottom of this frame. Just see them down there. So they do that sometimes. It's a phenomenon that I think called festooning, and nobody really knows why they do it particularly, but it can look quite funny sometimes. Okay, so then we've got that last frame that we just popped to one side earlier on, and the worst thing we can do with bees is to squash them against each other. So although it's going to seem strange, we're going to shake the bees onto the top here. So that frame's now almost empty of bees, and when we slide it in, we haven't got to worry about squashing any bees, and that's much safer for the bees. Perfect, it's gone in, we've not squashed any, and that's good. So we'll give them some smoke now, just to get all those bees to go back down onto the frame, because we don't want them all flying around while we're trying to put the hive back together, because we don't want to be squashing them. We want to know where the bees are. So the queen excluder is the one that goes on next, and we just slide it around to make it fit. Lovely. And I am going to put an empty frame on here, an empty box. So if I've got some storing an empty box, I've got an empty box to go on the top, and just carefully place it so we're not squashing in it. And we just want to space all these frames out so that the bees have got room to move around in there. Once there's a bit of honey in them, we won't have to worry about that, it'll be nice and strong. So, here we go. Okay, so that box is on. And then we've got the last box, which is on the floor. There we go, so the hive's put back together and it's taller now. Got an extra box on it. So got loads of bees in the lid, so we'll just pat them off. So you'll see that we shake bees quite a bit, but that doesn't do them any damage so long as you're just nice and careful with it.
And then of course we need to put the lid on, because in the UK we have lots of rain and we want to keep them nice and dry and safe. And so that's it, we've done a full bee inspection, so you've seen through a whole hive now. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning about our honeybees. They're absolutely fascinating, and if you ever get a chance to go and do beekeeping in person, I'd recommend it. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you all for watching.